Mabuhay and I don't know, good afternoon to everyone. I am Brenda Rodriguez Alegre. I would like to thank Dr. Kay Dayan and um, her entire team, and of course, Ateneo Dinaga University for inviting me and sharing this space with all of you. I am a trans Pinay. I am a transgender woman from the Philippines. But I'm currently based in Hong Kong, and I am a part of STRAP, the Society of Trans Pinays. Well, formerly, or for the longest time, we call ourselves Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines, but it should be Society of Trans Pinays. I'm also part of ILGA Asia as a Southeast Asian representative, and currently my day job is as a lecturer at the University of Hong Kong, where I teach at the Gender Studies program. I teach several courses, a couple of which I created. I created a course called Queering Art, Performance, and Cities, which is going to run for the first time this year, this coming school year. I also created a major course for gender studies called Trans Asia, where I talk about transness and otherness in Asia. I have been here in Hong Kong for 11 years. I started as a teaching assistant, and then I have eventually moved up the academic ladder. And I've been doing advocacy and activism work on LGBTQI, women's and migrants' rights, maybe for the past 20-ish years. I've lived in the Philippines for most of my life, except for the last 11 years. But I visited, and I am still active with STRAP. I'm on the board of directors, and I continue to do advocacy work on LGBTQI women's and migrants' rights. So why am I here? I am not even sure if I would be a very inspiring presence for all of you, but hopefully I could contribute something, to how we find that self-realization and empowerment. So that's why there's no fear queer, right? And we embrace our queerness, our transness, our otherness, and in various forms. You have the platforms of literature, film, art, and research. And maybe on my end, I've been more of a specialist in the academe and the advocacy work. Maybe you could consider me as a researcher, but I'm not even a very active researcher, so to speak. But I have been doing research. And I think altogether the layers of identities that I embody, as a lecturer or a teacher, if you may, as an activist, as a writer and a researcher, and also once in a while as a part-time entertainer, was once part of a choir. I may be able to share with you my journey, and hopefully some parts of my journey would resonate with you on a positive note through this experience or through this sharing. So let me share my screen with all of you. And hopefully you would see it. And let me call my presentation From Asog to Bakla to Trans Pinay, Trans History. So, but why did I actually call my presentation that way? Whereas I'm really more of sharing with you, some aspects of the academic work that I do, the research that I do, the advocacy and the activism work that I do, and the conversations that I spark. But I tend to use this title, maybe some forms of it, From Asog to Bakla to Trans Pinay. Maybe I'm sharing the journey of our identity, our pre-colonial transness. You could call it differently. You could call it Babaylan, Asog, Catalonan, etc. At some point later in the post-war years, it may have turned into the word bakla, and I have been referred to as bakla. I called myself bakla proudly. And then later on, I have called myself transgender, transsexual, transgender, and then trans Pinay. And so I realized that if we are going to be talking about decolonization, it will be talking about intersectionality, but as well as self-realization and empowerment. It's important for us to also understand something about our ancestry, our histories. Yes. And for this session of No Fear Queer, towards a journey of self-empowerment and self-realization and empowerment in film, research, literature. In my presentations, I tend to use a quote. I have used several over the years. So maybe if you'll be doing talks, you'll be giving talks, you'll be invited for a seminar, you could also, this could be a potential approach for you. Maybe pick out a quote that resonates with you. This is one of those. Someone I tell you in another time will remember us. And well, I'm giving credits to where credit is due. So CTTO, as they say, from the quotes.in. And this legend, or historical figure, Sappho, I'm crediting as well with this empowering line. And I think if we move towards that journey of self-realization, we sometimes find ourselves asking, but who are we? And will someone remember us in time? And I guess Sappho has already achieved that because we remember Sappho. So Sappho can be a voice that reminds you in literature, of the powerful works that she has contributed. But then in terms of queer literature, queer history, and queer meaning making, you'd eventually appropriate the word sapphic as inspired by Sappho to refer to queer love. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. So I'm sharing this with you because it could be very inspiring to be reminded of these quotes, right, that we come across in the works of literature or art. It can be even an art form. It can be a work of art, a painting. Perhaps this one that you could see behind me. I'm using as my background this very famous mural and of the Babaylan. So if we're talking about Asog, Babaylan, our ancestry, then that's one way of paying tribute, right, to our history. It's not just a part of our past, it's who we are. So who we are will always be remembered in some ways or in some forms. In my presentations, in my talks, in my conversations, I would be explaining what transgender means. And unfortunately, most of the literature that I have to borrow is of Western making, or of Western origins. I guess we start somewhere and then we trigger our own works. So as a researcher, in my journey of empowering myself as a researcher, I began with trying to understand, who I am as a person and who I am in terms of my gender and in terms of my sexuality. And in the umbrella of identities that falls under transgender or transness, there are so many labels there. We could choose. There could be more than enough choices. Sometimes there are no choices. So you could come up with your own identity, your own label. And what matters is you embody and you acknowledge your full rights towards self-identification and self-determination. So whenever we are invited to give a speech, talks, or participate in conversations, we should remind our audience that we have to honor our rights towards self-determination and self-identification. I believe the Jogjakarta Principle reminds us of this. So I'm also using this slide, because it's a way of grounding our definitions in terms of trans or transgender. And there could be better definitions out there, right? You could even come up with a proposition, on how we can better define trans Pinay or trans Pinoys or another terminology that could come up in the process. But doing research, community research, literature, focus group discussions, right? And interviews, surveys, etc. you would definitely gain some groundings, in terms of understanding why identities have to be talked about, why we write about them, why we perform them. So I think the participants today, some of you are representing different disciplines, maybe from the area of art and literature, media, communications, journalism and writing, history, comparative literature, gender studies, whatever it is, just know that there are more than enough literature out there that we can look for. But if there's not enough literature, then it means we have to create, right? We have to create these literature. I remember my thesis, my university thesis, my master's thesis, and then PhD. I studied in the Philippines. I earned my master's degree at the University of Santo Tomas and my PhD, both of which in psychology. And I remember doing my research. I went to the libraries of I was going to the libraries. Yes, so you can just imagine which generation I come from, because in our time we were going to the libraries for the books. Some of the literature I was looking for, they're not on the internet, they're not on Google or Google Scholar, or they're not on academia.com. They couldn't be downloaded on PDF format. We have to really look for books. And I went to the UP library, the LaSalle library, and the Ateneo de Manila library, because maybe the collections in terms of gender studies and sexuality studies at the University of Santo Tomas wasn't enough, right? So in terms of journeying as a researcher, it's important for us to acknowledge that at every point that we find ourselves in a dead end or a loop, right, or uncertainties, we have to keep going. We have to continue. We have to search. And if there are questions that couldn't be answered, then we have to find answers ourselves. If there are literatures that are absent, then we have to create the literature. So my master's thesis may be probably one of the earlier local studies done by a trans academic on transness. My master's thesis was about the phenomenological approach on self on trans. I forget the exact title of my thesis. It's funny, isn't it? But then it's using a phenomenological approach to research. I was trying to surface, how self-identification for trans women happen, right? Because my master's is in psychology, it's important for me to look into the developmental process of meaning making through experience, through language, lexicon, through narratives, right? And how did I come up with that? Let me share with you, because this is a journey towards self-realization and empowerment. I proposed this topic, this thesis, so my thesis proposal stage to a professor. I was inviting this professor as an advisor. So I would not name anymore. This professor is not with the university in the first place anymore, not anymore. And he said that my topic on transgender people is too controversial and too provocative, whatever that meant to him. But I thought that that's the reason why you engage in a study, because it has to be controversial, it has to be provocative, it has to be stirring someone else's imagination and someone's sense of censorship, however you like to call that. So I felt that it's worth the study. And if no one's doing it or not enough literature is found, then you really have to do it. And it interests you. So if you're a student and you wanted to come up with a thesis proposal, a study, then it has to be something that interests you. It has to be unique. It has to draw your attention, and it should be something that will raise someone's eyebrows like this, right? And eventually cause that professor to reject you, and so that you can look for another professor to accept you. So what I did, I cried. After crying, I decided to approach the director for research, and he was very supportive because he's queer. He's queer. So I'm so grateful he's queer. So this is no fear queer, right? So as a trans woman, why would I be afraid of what I'll be researching when it's worth researching? So I presented this to a scholar, and this scholar has his PhD, very accomplished, well published, and he understands easily right off the bat that it's worth the study. So he recommended that I look for another advisor, and I was able to find the right one. So I found the right advisor. Maybe he's also clear, or maybe not, doesn't matter. But the best part is he knows that everything can be studied under the sun, so to speak. And then we look for another supervisor for research, and I invited Dr. Sam Winter. From the University of Hong Kong. This is the first time that I would meet him. He's a cisgender man. He identifies as straight, but he is an ally to the trans community because his interest and research is on trans people. So there you go. And he also shared when we were getting to know each other that his colleagues and other academics also found his approach towards his research quite controversial. And that's the point of it all, right? So now you found your advisors. It's time for you to invite people on the panel. And I decided to invite the right people on the panel. So one of which was Dr. Professor Margarita Holmes. She's, if you don't remember her, in my generation, she was one of the biggest names. She was like a celebrity academic, a celebrity psychologist. She had several TV programs, several books, landmark work, queer works, and has always been a real ally, to the LGBTQ Filipino communities. And so I invited her, and she has definitely mentored me. She has helped me review my proposal, and she's contributed greatly to the shaping of my master's thesis. So maybe I'm leaving you with that at this point, that if you have a research proposal, believe in it. You have to believe in it, believe in yourself. If you fall, get right up, encourage yourself, empower yourself, right? And realize, that this is part of the journey. If you feel like crying, cry. But then you don't give up. So how did I prove to my panel that this is worth the study? Well, I was able to look for some literature that could be worth it. Most of them are foreign literature. I was doing my research around the early 2000s. So the literature on queer studies was quite still growing, and locally, not enough. But let's just say that it's enough for me to pull something together. Yeah. So that's something to share. When I got to my PhD journey, I have become stronger, more resilient, and more inspired. And I realized my mistakes the first time. So I decided that I'll be more empowered the second time. So still doing my PhD in the same university in UST, I still invited my professor, Professor Rosalito de Guzman, who I admired, and he's my co supervisor, but one of my supervisors, research supervisors. And I think that's one technique that at least I was allowed in the university to do, invite the same people who believed in you and the work that you do. So because sometimes that's setting up for success means inviting people who will believe in your potential success. Because if someone believes in your failure rather than in your success, why work with them in the first place? I that's where I'm coming from. Someone else can give a corollary statement, but then to me, I believe in that. So I invited Dr. Sam Winter again as a co-research supervisor. Yeah, and then I wanted to take my research to the next stage. So I decided to do a comparative study. One was a research of, I'm sorry, I did not put the titles here. I wanted this presentation to also be quite conversational. I have two research for my dissertation. One was quantitative, so it's mixed methods, a quantitative look into the medical transitioning process of transpenise. So we tried to do surveys and questionnaires on what were the transitioning process of some identified transpenise in the Philippines. And we were focused on hormones and silicone injections. And then, so there's that. And then the results of that showed that a lot of all of our respondents did not have medical supervision in their transitioning. They learned about hormones and silicone injections through their friends only. No research, no doctors involved, and most of the people administering their silicones are non-medical personnel. They're not nurses. They're not doctors. Yeah. So it's interesting findings, right? And it's worth the research, right? So should be continued to I should continue to research on that, or someone else should pick up from that. And then my second research there was the comparative study on the self-perception of transitioning trans people in the Philippines and Hong Kong. So I wanted to know if trans people who were transitioning or in a transitioning process. So you have to take note as well that I was doing research in the early 2000s. So the language of transness and otherness and queerness, it evolves, it changes. So at that time, you could say it's more old school, so to speak. And the trans respondents I had from Hong Kong showed that here in Hong Kong, it's more important for them to have a legal recognition to their gender, and important for them to undergo bottom and top surgeries. So they want to have surgeries that affirms the body that will match their papers. But in the Philippines, it's more of the social presentation. So for trans women in particular, your face, your body should attract affirmation from a crowd. Well, that's the results. So that may not be true to everyone, of course, right? And that would fall into the limitations of your findings. So you have scope and limitations in your findings and your research, and that would probably be among those. So what lessons that I learned in my journey doing my master's and my PhD thesis is, one, we have to look for people who will believe in our journey. Two, we have to believe in ourselves and the journey that we take. We have to be empowered, but sometimes empowerment doesn't come in a snap. You find it, you build that resilience, that strength. It cannot be always found in the books how you become stronger. You cannot always find friends that encourage you very specifically. They sometimes give you token support, but because it's the right thing to say or do. But you have to find the strength. You make mistakes, Three, you have to convince your institution that this is worth the research, because you contribute something to the field, to the university, to the department. But it's more of you contribute to the knowledge, right? And there should be no gatekeepers to knowledge. And it's always problematic when only a certain group monopolizes what should be learned and what should not be learned. Speaking of things to learn, in my journey, I also learned that transness have deep cultural roots, and they come with different names. Like in India or in the South Asian region, you have the hijras. So hijras are, sometimes I learned that hijras could be considered as the third gender or third sex, in India. But the best part is that they have been recognized by South Asian society for thousands of years. So they're an affirmation that transness and otherness is not modern, it's not Western, it's timeless. Being trans is as old as the first humans who have ever walked on the planet. So maybe if there is such a thing as Adam as the first man, maybe there is Shaddam, who is the first trans man, Eve, first trans woman, and Geneva as the first trans woman. Eve as first cis woman, and Geneva as the first trans woman. And there could be a first non-binary person, first intersex person. We are not new. We are not just a product of evolution. We are a product. We are not a product in the first place, but we are part of history. So in Indonesia, you have the waria, and the waria is just part of the gender landscape. There is a province there called Sulawesi, and in Sulawesi there's a tribe called the Bugis tribe, and the Bugis have a 5-gender system that includes the Chalabay, Chalalay, and the Bisu. So the Chalabay correct me if I'm wrong, is the transgender woman, the chalala is a transgender man, and the bisu would be the more of the androgynous or middle sex, perhaps intersex, Yeah. So what is the implication of that knowledge? That whoever says that you have to just propose for transgender LGBT, in legal nomenclature, whereas in every society, they have their own names, own words, that apply. In Hawaii, you have the Mahu. The Mahu are not just a third gender group. They are venerated, meaning they are highly respected, highly loved, regarded, deeply regarded. In Malaysia, the maknya, as far as I know, the maknya is a more modern term. It was created in the 1980s, and it was proposed by trans women grassroots organizers and sex workers. So what's the implication of that knowledge? It tells us that the sources of knowledge come from all around, including grassroots organization, women who do sex work, trans women, etc. Right? And trans women can define their own identities. So if the Malaysian trans women were able to come up with the word maknya, and the Malaysian transgender men were able to call themselves paknya, then trans Pinays in the Philippines can emerge as well to come up with another group of identities outside or within the bakla. So you have the bakla, the bayot, and if you look at the bayot, it could be condescending as a meaning because it's used in condescending ways, but then it could also be used in proud ways to reclaim a truth that it is part of your identity. It's how you could be called in that region because the country is an archipelago. So we have identities that just vary from place to place with lexicon that matches that. So these are just images, of these identities that I was talking about. Two-Spirit of North America, Warya in Indonesia, Mujes or Mujes in Mexico, Travesti in Latin America, Fa'afafine in Samoas. The Fa'afafines, there is a group of trans women in the Philippines called Bantut. And the Bantut was researched by Mark Johnson. He did an ethnographic and anthropological research in the late 1980s to 1990s, and this work became a landmark work. And it's very sad that it takes a white cisgender researcher to discover some things about our culture and our people, but we are already there. We're here, right? So the Bantuts could be found in I think Maguindanao. I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe Southern Cotabato. I forgot the exact part of Mindanao, but then they're from Mindanao. And culturally speaking, they're quite similar to the Filipinos in the sense that they love being domestic divas. It's a choice. Nobody forced them to stay at home. And when you talk about gendering jobs, professions, work, etc., in their case, they just love what they're doing at home, cleaning the house, fixing, the children's meals, taking care of them, nursing them, cleaning, cooking, right? Going to the market. These are some of the things that the Papapina and the Bantut share in common. And sometimes when let's say it was believed that when the brood of a family is like an all male, one of the children, particularly the youngest, has to turn into a Filipino. So whether that's true or not, it means that society in different parts of the world, different societies look at gender in different ways. But in the Philippines, we were immersed to a particular revisionist sense of history and colonial and post-colonial sense of history. And we have to uproot ourselves from that, revise it, and acknowledge that in our pre-colonial years, the Bantuts have shown, the Teduray people, the Babaylans have shown that we exist and we are powerful and empowered. But we were weakened and marginalized and oppressed over time during the colonial and post-colonial years. Sister girls and brother boys in Australia. Australia is a product of colonial and imperial shifts as well as America itself. But America's history is also a revisionist history, like they didn't tell us that people were decimated, bloodily. Their white imperialist colonialists were glorified over time. White cisgender people wrote the history books all over the world, at least in most parts of the world, including the Philippine histories. They were written by the Priles, right? The friars. And so where do you find the queer babaylans in our history? No, you don't find them. How do we know about that? Well, because there's oral tradition in Philippine history. They forgot about that. So in oral tradition, they have kept the traditions, they protected it, they preserved it. It is found in art, it's found in some forms of literature that exists, and we know about it. And if you want further links to the Babaylan, you have the Teduray people, right? From Mindanao. You have the Bantus. So as you go through that journey of self-realization and empowerment, as I said, we look back not because we are stuck, to that sense of past, but we want to learn from the past because there were mistakes, but there were glorious aspects of the past. And one of the glorious aspects of the past is that we had a culture, and our culture was rich, it was diverse, it was inclusive, it was empowering. So these are images of deities that we used to believe in. Some Filipinos forget, especially the Catholics, they have already forgotten that Philippine society was an animist society back in the day, meaning we worshipped nature. We were stewards of nature. We worshiped the stream, the bodies of water, the mountains, the trees, the animals. So if you defile nature, then nature comes back to you in the forms of malignancy, maybe in the forms of evil spirits, right? Like the mythology of the aswang was also reshaped in the colonial years. But in the pre-colonial years, what was the aswang are simply malevolent spirits of nature that showed anger and spite, towards the people who defiled nature, right? But the babaylans who have the ability to see, and to talk to these spirits are able to contain and then eventually negotiate with the spirits. So the babaylans are also able to invoke the benevolent spirits. Example would be the deities, such as what was portrayed here by Gina Rosero, a Filipino supermodel. And she here represents Lakapati or Ikapati. Queer historians would make certain claims, or historians would make certain claims that, Lakapati is probably queer. Lakapati is probably not queer. But, what haves? But what matters is that there surely should be, we're sure about that, queers in history, right? In mythology, and even among the deities, right? Whether they exist or not, we're pretty sure at least one of them is queer. And if you'll be doing your presentations, it will be very good, that you showed those beautiful works of arts, right, that captures that part of our history. And I'm just sharing these with you. So back in the day, the babaylans were the healers, they were shamans, they were midwives, they were carers, but they were also sources of knowledge and wisdom. The datu or the rajas or the sultans would consult with them. And they were also feared because they don't just bless, they also curse. And functionally speaking, what the babaylans do in the Philippines are quite shared with what the hijras do in India, what the two-spirit do in North America, the Mahu in Hawaii, the travesti in the mujeres in Mexico. Yeah. So as we look into literature, there are many words that capture these identities like bayogin, bayok, agingin. It's very good for us to look into the nuances of, and maybe there are specialists among you, right? Linguists, historians, comparative literature scholars among you. Then I leave it up to you. I am not here claiming expertise. I'm just here actually borrowing, the fountain of knowledge that they have already given us and just sharing it with you. That in the process of meaning making, there you would find answers. And sometimes you seek counsel, from the wise, right? From the grassroots communities. So we have to reconnect with them and try to look into ourselves, reflect. But how can you be a better version of yourself if you'll be engaging in such research? So maybe you talk to yourself, about check, about how inclusive is your language. Because, when we talk about inclusive language, our language has actually showed a lot of prejudice and discrimination over time, right? If we use English as an example, words like blacklist and whitelist is prejudicial now. And maybe 10 years ago, it was okay to use them. When you say sanity check, that's a problematic word because why should there be a sanity check when you can just simply say recheck, double check, right? So if there is sanity, then there is absence of sanity. So we should not use that. Also, when you use the word tribe or tribal, it might be okay for you. You have no intention of using that. Rihanna once used that word. But the thing is, to the First Nations people, to some people that comes from tribes, that can be offensive, right? So we have to look at our language, how inclusive it is, and how we could contribute to evolving the language, the use of language. Filipino, at least particularly Tagalog, you could look at that as a gender-free or gender-neutral, language. Like when I give my pronouns, I have to say she and her. That's the English gendered language. But then, well, of course, if you go French and Spanish and German, they're also gendered. Surprisingly, a non-colonized country like Thailand also has gendered language. That's why you have the kap and the ka, right? But in the Philippines, you have the siya or siya, kanya, right? These are not gendered. So if our language is not gendered, even if we were colonized, why is it that we don't find that sense of empowerment, of removing the gendering, from our language? Yeah, well, I'm not demonizing the Spaniards, but then the thing is, they have uh, contributed to the demise of our natural culture, or what was at least there, what's endemic in our country. They reshaped it to fit, their patriarchal, their colonial, their imperialist gaze, right? And so now we have to actually dismantle that and decolonize ourselves. These images were from a curated uh, exhibit, I guess about 10, 15 years ago, that showed real images of queer men and women in the Philippines in the last years of the Spanish colonial years. So very empowering, right? So to the artists here, like the photojournalist, then you may consider doing something like that, curating an exhibit, celebrating queer history or empowering queer movements. In the American colonial years, what I'm highlighting would be the reforms in education that eventually would introduce us to the concept of pathologizing genders and sexualities, particularly the introduction of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Behavioral Disorders, and the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases. And here, the implication of this presentation is to remind the audience that in pre-colonial Philippines, there is no abnormality in queerness. In fact, there is full greatness in queerness. There's empowerment in queerness. But we have been pathologized by Western and modern science and medicine, Something to talk about as well is bakla, I mean, like in the 1980s, that was the only word that would be used on a lot of GBQT, so trans women, drag queens, non-binary men, gay men, or bisexual men. There's the word bakla has been commonly used. And if you are a trans woman in the 80s and you went to Thailand, for some surgeries, transitioning surgeries, top and bottom surgeries, then they sometimes would refer to you as a transsexual, But when they translate that, it still translates as bakla. So what does bakla mean? Maybe you can look at it as a very wide umbrella, wherein it is like a gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual identity, sexual behavior, gender role, gender stereotype term. And the opposite of which is tomboy. For the media scholars among you, it will be interesting if you talk about how LGBTQI people were portrayed. Because like in cinemas, particularly like the 1970s and early 80s, cisgender and non-queer identifying actors perform queer roles. Like, for example, Dolphy would often perform the gay and the trans roles. At one point, I'm not sure if it's just one time, maybe two, no, more than once. Nora Honor, who's now a national artist, once portrayed tomboy, supposedly in the film, the earlier version of Jack and Jill. I think that's not the first, maybe the second version, the one I have here on my screen. And then she also portrayed a lesbian in the movie Tiber at Ako with Vilma Santos. So, and then there was Joey De Leon, who provided the comedic and the usual comedic treatment. But what's the implication here? Well, maybe an implication that you can draw is to also look at the Western documentary film that was released in 2020 called Disclosure. And in that very beautiful, powerful documentary, they were nitpicking and they were analyzing, how trans and queer representation was, in a way, very problematic for a long time in America, at least in America. But in the Philippines, it is probably even more problematic, because if there are no queer characters in a movie, they will be portrayed by cis and non-queer actors. And at the same time, they do like a conversion therapy. I call it that way, Why? Because the gay or the trans character at the end of the film will not have a happy ending. Sometimes he or she will remain gay or trans, but he or she will not, whether it's gay or a trans character, will not end up with their ideal man. However, the lesbian or the tomboy or maybe the trans man will actually be converted, So if this character, Nora Honor, Maricel Soriano, whoever played the tomboy, the lesbian, the transgender roles, at the end of the film, they will be turned into a feminine, heterosexual, cisgender woman who will eventually fall for the lead, good-looking, cisgender straight protagonist. That's how problematic it is. So there's a point of interest, for the film scholars, right, to look into. In my presentations, in my talk, and even in my research, I also dive into the pageant culture of the Philippines. We're very much influenced, by, of course, cis women in pageantry. That's why when I was growing up, watching Miss Universe, Miss World, Miss International, Miss Asia Pacific, and eventually the local versions like Binibining Pilipinas, Mutyanang Pilipinas, it was such an experience for us queer young kids back in the day. But I eventually learned greater excitement watching the quote-unquote Miss Gay pageants. That's how they would call these contests. MGP here in this photo would stand for Miss Gay Philippines. So these were the Miss Gay Philippines winners over the years. So what's the implication of this? It is that historically, trans women have to engage in the pageant platform so that they can be visible. We can be visible. I've also engaged in it. I've joined these pageants. I've won a few. I've lost most. But I think it gave me a sense of self-realization and empowerment, because I was able, before joining the pageants, I thought that it was only for certain types of beauties. But after I realized, but beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and the way for you to clinch that crown is for you to answer that question in the end. And it shows your smarts, your intelligence, your eloquency, in terms of delivery. And if I had those in spades, so maybe I deserve my crown at some point, right? And we talk about pageantry because you have the gaze on the other end. You have the male gaze, the cisgender, the straight gaze, right? But we also talk about how problematizing pageantry on another end is the sexualization and the objectification experienced by the pageant contestants, not just cisgender and transgender women, but even cisgender men and even transgender men who join pageants too. But then, looking past the sexualization and the objectification, if you're able to use this as a political platform, to talk about change in policies, visibility, issues of marginalization, showing talent, in press and issues, then yes, it goes beyond the objectification. And in my work, and I also talk about the movement because this is how we learned about the lexicon of our identities. The first organization I actually joined was, I didn't really join this formally, but in 1990, oh, I just revealed, I was a fetus in 1992. Just kidding. In 1992, I was in high school. I joined Pro Gay informally. I think they were planning a series of marches, and it would culminate, I think, in the 1994 nationwide march protesting the EVAT. EVAT was the extended value added tax. And that really was a problematic time in the Philippines. Well, it's always been problematic in the country, especially most recently with the results, unfavorable results of the election. Sorry, but then just being honest about it. But just to talk about why it is important to be engaged in the movement is you're showing the other Filipinos that what issues affect you affect us. So that's intersectionality for you, right? The EVAT affected not just X number percent of Filipinos, it affected all Filipinos, regardless of your sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expressions. So pro-gay would eventually give rise to or inspire other organizations to form, such as STRAP, the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines. We were formed in 2002. So we're now officially 20 years old. And STRAP was the very first to introduce a term trans-Pinay. So how did we come up with the term trans-Pinay? We have our Yahoo group. So in our Yahoo, we voted for terms. And we thought that maybe since we were, as a nod to our post-colonial selves, we can retain the prefix trans, right? But then we used the word Pinay, right, to capture that part of us, Filipinas. And there are more groups that became TG inclusive, right? Ladlad is also the first political queer organization, LGBT organization in the Philippines. The University of the Philippines, Babaylan, UP Babaylan, I think it became chartered in 1992, would be, as far as we know, one of the first, if not the first, university-recognized LGBT organization. And of course, they give homage to the Babaylan. The Babaylan, I give homage as well. Tao there is Trans-Pinays of Antipolo organization. You have the Philippines, and you have the Beteras Powerhouse of Beauty. So we're just talking about the beauty queens, right? The emergence of the Trans-Pinoys also came after STRAP. I think in 2009, 2010, the first Trans-Pinoy organization came about. It's the Pinoy FTM. Eventually, there would be another group that comes after that, Transman Pilipinas. So what are the problems that we raise in our conversations? We talk about the Philippine Constitution, the labor code, the family code, and whatever laws are missing or whatever laws are problematic, that excludes SOGI and that excludes LGBTQI people in everything or in a lot of things. So we don't have gender recognition in the Philippines. We don't have sexuality unions or equality unions in terms of sexuality. We don't have SOGI equality or anti-discrimination. These are all problematic because we need laws that protect everyone. So just to remind you, the SOGI equality bill is an equality bill. It's for everyone because we all have SOGI, SOGI SC. Yeah. And when we talk about our advocacy, we also update them. This is not the most updated version. Taking this from Eric Manalasta's website, I think there's more to this already. You know, we may have around 14 or 15. Correct me if I'm wrong. You know, you can be more updated there. Cities and municipalities that have currently the anti-discrimination ordinance. I think recently, Zamboanga has joined this, right? And if there's someone from Zamboanga, you may connect with Tony G. Fernandez, who is among those who helped in the conversation, right? Yeah. So if there's no gender recognition, what could be the problems that we look into? We look at the absence. Well, birth certificates will constantly be asked for. Birth registry. And for trans women, this is a painful document because we are constantly being reminded that you are a man or you're a woman. You're male at birth. You'll always be male. Whatever you do, whatever you have now, right? School records cannot be changed. It's immutable. And they have what we call pink forms back in the day. You know, school uniforms. The way uniforms are designed, they're not affirming of genders for some people. And why? You know, it's okay to have uniforms. Why can't you choose your particular uniform? Yeah, I'm happy to wear a uniform. I was forced to actually, but I'd like to wear a uniform that corresponds to my gender identity. In our talks, we also include like something like this: a gender model. The genderbread person is one of the most popular. I think it is the most popular. It's not the only model out there, and it may not necessarily be the best, but it is quite straightforward, you know, in dissecting and differentiating gender identity from gender expression, from sexuality to attractions. If you could use this on a child, you know, and just translate this, diba? And that's a problem, I guess. Our language needs to catch on with the Western counterparts because we actually predate the the Western lexicon for LGBTQI matters. But why can't we come up with that version, right? So hopefully, so I challenge everyone, you know, the queers in this session, no fear queers, right? That you could come up with different translations for the gender identities, gender expressions, sexual orientations, etc. In the process of in the journeys towards empowerment and self-realization, we cannot also take away the pain, the struggles, the oppressions, and of course um the crimes, you know. So excuse me, pardon me for that. But then like Donna Niera and Jennifer Laude have become poster women or poster children, you know, of hate crimes in the Philippines. So in the art that you do, you know, the literature work that you do, in the research that you would engage in, you could look for ways, you know, to address discrimination and prejudice, absence of laws, and how that leads, you know, affects everyone from womb to tomb. And how important it is to talk about intersectionality, you know, like the Philippines have concerns with racism. Yeah. Not just because there are people from other races or ethnicities in the country, but even us, right? We have colorism as a problem. Colorism is a problem in the Philippines. You know, darker skinned Filipinas talking about whitening products, that's problematic. So we have to address that. Classism, you know, is problematic. Ableism, ageism, how your casual remarks that, oh, she's so old already. Oh, that's so long ago, right? So sometimes I poke fun, you know, with it, but I'm proud, you know, I'm proud to admit that I come from an earlier generation because maybe that generation allowed me to witness some of the greater struggles back in the day, and maybe there are also opportunities that's gone. Heterosexism and cis privileges, right? So at the center of it all is intersectionality. When we talk about the waves of feminism, we have to talk about how problematic the earlier waves are, you know, because all oppression is connected. So when you have privilege on one layer, you will have oppressions on others, you know. So if your gender identity is oppressed, maybe your sexuality is a privilege, you know. Like, so for trans women, when I have an experience wherein I was questioned for using the women's toilet because I was asked, why I use this toilet. What's my gender identity? What's my legal gender? What's my genitals that I undergo surgery, and all invasive questions. And so after all is said and done, when I showed them photos, or they look at photos or videos of me being with men, and they saw men on one of the albums I have, they realize I'm oriented towards men, that I'm attracted to men. So they freed me. So the reason why they questioned me was because they thought that I am just a man pretending to be a woman, went to a women's toilet so that I can take photos and videos of women. But they didn't find photos and videos of women except my own photos. And they found photos of men. So it's like my gender identity got me in trouble, but my sexual orientation saved me. So that was one analogy that I realized after that experience. So because some layers will be your source of oppression, while another layer will be your source of privilege. So that's why we have to understand that all oppression is connected, as all privileges are. So cisness, whiteness, Europeanness, Americanness, straightness, etc. These are aspects of privileges. So we have to talk about it, dismantle it. So there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives, as per Audre Lorde, right? And when I talk about movement, I also show them, why these are the existing officers and board members, board of directors of STRAP. But it's because the work that we do opens conversation. It inspires other trans women. We have met trans women, who said that if not for STRAP, if not for the individual members of STRAP, they would not be where they are at this point. So it's very touching to hear that, because when I was growing up, I didn't see a lot of trans women in public. There were a few of them, like some of the, like I saw Fanny Serrano, but the late Fanny Serrano, but she didn't identify as trans. There was Helen Cruz, and she was the only one that identified as transsexual, and she was very proud of it. And there was Boots Babushka, who was also doing drag, but she didn't also identify as trans. So now that there are more of us, maybe young trans and queer kids would have someone to look up to later on. And that's how I end my presentation, and it went quite long, but I hope it is useful. And I'm just here to remind you that the work that we do takes a lot of courage, but the courage starts, it begins here. And sometimes you can't find it. Some of us go through series of traumatic events that invalidates our character or personhood. And sometimes you can't pick yourself up, but then you just simply ask for help. And someone would probably, there's someone out there who would probably offer that helping hand. So if the sharing that I gave, the images, the keywords, hopefully you'd find something useful out of it. And with that, thank you again. Congratulations on this amazing, amazing event. I'm so proud to be part of it. So thank you.